The Winnipeg Jets might be facing a tougher Central Division, but is it really one to be afraid of, or are the Jets still in pretty good position to lead the pack? Find out in tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, we're going to start off talking about the Central Division because in a lot of ways, the Central has gotten better overall. But I think the biggest question for the Central is, does it really matter? Are the teams that got better actual contenders? Are we looking at squads that haven't really perhaps moved the needle as much as I think they would like to? Or, are the Jets perhaps facing some pretty stiff competition? We'll talk about that in just a little bit because I think it is a more complicated question than it appears. But before we dive into tonight's episode, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Indeed. Still searching for a great candidate for your company? Don't search, just match with Indeed. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Now, like I said, the Central Division this offseason has seen quite a bit of movement. I think a lot of teams, generally speaking, have tried to make the most of a relatively fortuitous opportunity to stack up your depth signings in free agency. I think where I tend to have some questions is, whether or not the division really improved in a meaningful way. I think a lot of the teams that were sort of at the bottom or perhaps maybe even in the more mid-tier definitely improved, but I don't know if it really matters. You're talking about teams that are, for the most part, well, if you're in the bottom of the division, right, probably not that good. But if you're in the middle to like upper crust, it can be hard to really improve significantly. And so I think when I look at a team like Chicago, right, the Blackhawks were super aggressive. They've made a ton of moves. Of course, they've got Artyom Levshunov now in their whole draft ranks, and I'm pretty sure that they're pretty excited about it. They made some moves prior to the draft, including that whole Ilya Mikheyev trade, which was interesting, I guess. But overall, right, where I kind of see a team like this moving is not much more than slightly up the bottom of the rankings, right? Bringing in Brody, Maroons, Craig Smith, Brossoit, Martinez. These guys, for me, are perhaps upgrades on what they had before, but that's not really saying much. I would say Teravainen and Bertuzzi are probably bigger acquisitions, but I think to what end, right? Bedard definitely needs support in order to not have his confidence cratered. I think you can only allow him to keep playing with middle sixers and bottom sixers through the early parts of his career for so long before you start to wonder if there's really a plan to improve. But I look at a team like Nashville, right? And the Preds were perhaps one of the most aggressive teams in the offseason. And yeah, Nashville definitely got better. And I would say that especially in the short term, this is a team that looks relatively dangerous. But I think the biggest thing for them is that they might have tried to push this a little too aggressively. Trotz has always been an interesting hire. I think it's hard for me to read exactly what his plan is because when he came into the job, he did talk about needing to pick up top-end talent through the draft. He said pretty clearly that you can't really just sign them in free agency. And yet, what has he done? Well, he went out and got himself Steven Stamkos, Brady Shea. They made a move to bring in Jonathan Marchessault. They re-signed Usisaros for 8 years. And so I look at this team and I'm like, okay, so that might be a squad that was kind of on the cusp. They had a really good late run to get into the playoffs, but then in the playoffs, they kind of got exposed a bit. So sure, in the short term, I think they might have recognized that this team was perhaps better under Burnett, but I do wonder if signing all of these big money deals and huge contracts with lots of term for players who are perhaps a little bit on the older side is going to bite them in the not too distant future, right? I think the Stamkos signing is of a reasonable length, but then you look at the Shea deal and some of the others, and like 5, 6, 7 years, you're committing a fair chunk of money to some players who, as much as I think that they do help in the short term, maybe don't really move the needle as you start getting deeper and deeper into these contracts. And so for me, I look at a team like this and I'm like, do I think that they'll push for the top 3 of the Central? Arguably, yeah. I think it probably depends on what happens with Saros. Saros, they are definitely investing a lot into and hoping that he is one of the more premier goalies in this division, which at this point isn't saying much because outside of Hellebuck, there's really not many netminders in the Central that I would say are challenging for a crown here. Binnington has had his streaks, but other than that, this is generally Hellebuck's whole thing to lose. And, you look at Colorado kind of trying to work around the margins. They don't have a lot of cap space. They've mostly done a lot of depth deals outside of bringing Middlestat back. So I don't know. I think the Central has generally improved in terms of like raising the floor. But then I think the top of the division has definitely seen a bit of a decline. With the Winnipeg Jets, I think they're in an interesting position where, yes, they did get worse on paper, but I think it was for the right reasons. And I think despite having a decrease in the overall experience and quality on paper, I do think that a faster and more skilled approach with a younger lineup is still going to have really good results overall, assuming everything goes well for Arneal. So I still think that they are likely to have a pretty strong season. The team that I would be most curious about is Dallas. I think the Stars have taken a pretty considerable step back. They're losing Pavelski, and while they have tried to bring in some free agents and stuff, my overall impression with the Stars is that their defense kind of got obliterated. Tanev's gone. They've brought in some more depth players like Lyubushkin and Capobianco, and let's be honest, Lyubushkin's not great. They've also signed Matt Dumba. He's not particularly good, and Capobianco is, going to be more of a depth player, and so I don't know. I feel like this division is a very strange one right now because it seems like it's caught between a couple of different places. I think, a lot of the teams that were really awful before have definitely moved up a little bit, but perhaps not enough to really make a difference. And so we're probably going to see a pretty similar 1, 2, 3. It wouldn't shock me if the Jets maybe push towards the top of this pile again. I feel like Winnipeg just has a fairly strong mixture to grow from. I think the young talent that the Jets are going to inject on top of Hellebuck being Hellebuck and a team's blue line that should be faster and more mobile this season, I think it portends better things for Winnipeg this year. I think Arneal is going to have some initial challenges, but I think over the first few months, Winnipeg is going to still have enough talent to work with to where it's not going to be as big of a deal. I do think Nashville's going to push them a lot more. And I wouldn't be shocked if the Hawks win a few extra games, which is going to be a little annoying, I would think. I think it's more that, there's more opportunities for the Jets to drop points than there is to gain them. Compared to last season, right? I still think Winnipeg will be near the top of the division. Wouldn't shock me if they finish second or third, but maybe somehow they end up in first. So it's a wide open division. I think that there's definitely some things the Jets can do to really solidify their hold, but maybe the top of this division is not going to be as scary as it was last year. Colorado, though, still has the opportunity to surprise us and do something really crazy. So let's just hope that they don't get too creative and put Winnipeg behind the 8 ball again. Now, speaking of teams that are trying to improve and stuff, obviously the McGroarty situation is still ongoing, and there's a Bleacher Report article out there from Joe Yerdon that was talking about some of the places where he could end up. We'll talk about the 6 teams that he listed and whether or not it really makes sense from Winnipeg's perspective in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed.com. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate is not searching at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed, because Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million globally monthly visitors and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. They help you ditch the busy work because they can schedule, screen, and message so you can connect with candidates faster. And the most important thing is that they're not just interested in helping you hire faster. They want to give you quality candidates that actually tick off the boxes you need. I've used it when I was looking for work, and I can personally tell you and attest to how easy it was to apply, how clear and guided it was. And it was a very seamless platform that I'm still getting email updates from. If you are like me and you've used them before, you know that it's great. And there are over 3.5 million businesses already using it worldwide that are looking to hire wonderful talents and candidates. For those of you who are in the business side of things and you're looking to hire, well, listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are currently chatting about, the Rutger McGroarty trade. Obviously, it's still a thing that's in progress. We don't know where he's going yet. And at some point, it does get a little bit frustrating to not really have much movement. We are all going off of rumors at this point. Things have really quieted down, and we're not really sure what teams are still in the hunt, but, well, plenty of people are still speculating, and there were 6 teams that a Bleacher Report article put out earlier today that suggests, good landing spots. I want to talk about whether they're really that good or whether it's not really much of a fit in the short term and long term in just a moment. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to let you know, for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourselves having to turn on the volume because you hate all the shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, let's start off with destination number 1. So the first team listed is the Boston Bruins. Now, on paper, the Bruins are a great fix for McGroarty, or a great landing spot for McGroarty. It makes a lot of sense. If you're talking about a top-end player that could move the needle for the Bruins, and that would obviously be a big on-ice and locker room leader, well, McGroarty's probably as close to a huge injection as this team is likely to find, because let's be honest, right? Boston's aging. They don't have a lot of top-end talent anymore. And when you're looking at a team that is probably trying to turn over some of the roster to get younger and bring in some skill that's also still kind of beefier and brawnier, well, it's a bit of a tightrope. And I think the Bruins don't really have a lot in the prospect ranks that can make the jump. McGroarty would easily become their number 1 prospect. I think you've got some other players like Lysell that could potentially slide in. But overall, right, you're not really seeing lots of top-end talent. Pasternak is definitely not getting younger. Marchand's nearing the end of his career. McAvoy definitely has more defensive support. But other than that, up front, this is a team that's being driven by guys like Coyle and Zacha, and obviously they've done a great job, but they've just lost DeBrusk, and they have lost Bergeron in the past couple of seasons, and so it's tough, right? And when you look at what's in their I guess warehouse of goodies to draw from, they don't really have a lot. So on paper, I think if you're looking for like a skill and culture fit, yes, the Bruins make a ton of sense. In terms of assets that the Jets could get back, well, probably not a great fit there. I think of the teams that are going to be fighting for McGroarty, Boston would have to be pretty far back in the list unless they're willing to trade something particularly valuable, and I just don't really see that being the case. A team that I could potentially see having these sort of assets to make this move, though, it's got to be Minnesota. Minnesota has kind of been in a weird transition state where they're definitely decent. I don't think that they're a great team, and I think that they probably have some longer term questions, but they've got a great goalie in the pipeline. They have some great young talent in guys like Boldy, Faber, and Kaprizov. But, the one that I think really catches my eye and that could be a player the Jets would be interested in is Marco Rossi. I think Rossi might have been the draft pick that, became Perfetti had Minnesota not made the Rossi pick right before. And Rossi would be a huge addition to the Jets roster. It'd solve one of our biggest questions about Winnipeg's second line center role. And I think for the Wild, Rossi hasn't quite impressed them as much as they'd like. McGroarty would be, a good Midwestern kid with a big shot, big frame, decent-ish skating, but I think he would fit in pretty nicely stylistically and culturally for what this kind of team is looking for. That's not to say that, they would be willing to give up Rossi in this deal, but maybe if they think that Rossi needs a change of scenery, switching him out for McGroarty could be a way to kind of do that. And McGroarty has played center before. I don't know that he would necessarily play center for them, but if they kind of see that his skating issues are going to prevent him from being a top-end winger, maybe they try that conversion and swap him in for Rossi. Minnesota, I could see actually being a pretty compelling partner. The only thing is, would they be willing to give up a Rossi type player? And would the Jets really want to trade him to a rival division team? I don't think it really makes that much of a difference. I think Minnesota is not really a squad that you're worried about necessarily, but some teams still have an older sense of all of this stuff. A team outside the division that gets name dropped here is the Philadelphia Flyers. And this is kind of an interesting one because the Flyers are a team that I don't really get in a lot of ways. I think that they've tried to cut some dead weight, but there's a lot of questions that I have of Briere in the front office. I don't quite know if they would want to go from trading Cutter Gauthier to bringing in Rutger McGroarty, right? That's Cutter's best friend, and given how that whole exit went, I can't imagine that McGroarty would be running to the Flyers. I would have to imagine he'd probably ex-nay that trade almost immediately. And honestly, the Flyers don't really have much that's of interest. I mean, unless you're talking about like a Sanheim, where the Jets would probably have to add for a deal. Just you're not really going to find much that's really intriguing. Maybe a Morgan Frost if somehow the Jets could add a bit there and bring him in, but the Flyers are not going to be interested in giving Frost up. So I think this is actually a pretty poor fit in a lot of respects. The last two teams the last three teams that get mentioned are the Calgary Flames, Ottawa Senators, and Anaheim Ducks. So the Flames, I would probably just not really think about that too much. Calgary has lots of cool young talents and prospects, but they're probably a team that can't really afford to make a big splash like that in terms of bringing in a McGroarty. I think this squad definitely would be interested in it, but perhaps more in the sense of making McGroarty like a free agency offer. I don't think that they have assets that they're willing to give up right now for McGroarty, unless they maybe look at some of the guys that they drafted this year and offer them in exchange, because they made a lot of really great value picks further down in the draft and even got some big steals. And maybe McGroarty being further along could be something that they parlay into a big return. But I think for me, I just think Calgary's not really in a great state to make this kind of move. Ottawa, the Sens have been making some moves, I guess. McGroarty, I don't know what the culture fits like there. They're a young team. They've got skill, but they're definitely flawed. And I think that there's been quite a bit of chaos with that squad over the past couple of seasons. McGroarty would definitely be a big personality to bring in right behind Stützle. And if you're looking to kind of shift that core forward, I guess it could make sense. I just don't know that the Sens have a particularly great pool of talent to offer Winnipeg in exchange. I think that there's some decent options, and I think you could look at a couple of different guys. I don't know, Shane Pinto or something, but, they just went through all of the extension stuff with him and all that. So, I just feel like this is not really that great of a fit. The team out of these last three that does actually seem like a potentially strong candidate, it's Anaheim, right? It's Cutter's new team. It would be a reuniting of the two talents. And, the Ducks have quite a bit on their defensive prospects list that I think would be of interest to the Jets. If Winnipeg wants to modernize their defense or potentially look at a deal up front where you maybe move a Zegras, who's kind of fallen out of favor, but is still an NHL talent, and you make a package around that, I don't know. I think you could see something happening there. I don't know if the Ducks necessarily want to go that route, but like, I don't know. It's an interesting conversation to have. I think Anaheim is kind of in that transition point where they definitely have a really bright future. And if they add McGroarty to that whole mixture, it becomes exciting for Ducks fans down the road. But again, would they be willing to move one of their younger roster players in exchange for that? And I don't know where their headspace is at, right? The Ducks have made some pretty decent moves over the last couple of seasons. Don't know if that's going to be the case, this offseason. But hey, if they do chase after McGroarty, they definitely have some pretty good assets to part with. Of these 6 teams, I'd love to hear which ones you think are actually a good fit. Drop your thoughts or suggestions in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. We're going to close out in just a couple of seconds here with some potential breakout candidates for the Jets. I'll talk about some sleeper picks that I've had, a couple of players I've mentioned on and off over the last few episodes, and some guys that I think are really primed for big spots in this upcoming season, all in just one moment. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's closing thoughts on this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for joining us as we're just wrapping up with some potential breakout candidates for this upcoming season. Some of these guys, I feel like calling them breakout candidates is perhaps a little disingenuous, but maybe they just haven't had a chance to really show at the level that you really believe them to be capable of. Prime example, Cole Perfetti. I mean, Perfetti, I've talked at length over the last few episodes. I'm going to keep this one brief. Look, the kid's super skilled. He's got a really strong two-way impact, and he started getting confidence in using his release more and more in the final few games of the season. If anyone is, primed to explode on this team with a bigger role and responsibility, it's Perfetti, hands down. I think his best case scenario this upcoming season is like 55 to 60 points. I think that would be a tremendous year from him. I'd be thrilled. But perhaps he even pushes further than that if he really starts to hum and fit in with this offense. Now, the next guy that I'm kind of interested in is Morgan Barron, and I don't know what role he's going to have with this team. Barron has kind of existed on the periphery of the attention span of most Jets fans, not because they haven't been keeping track of him, but because he's traditionally been a fourth liner, and I think with the flashes you see with him, there's a guy who looks like a middle sixer, but then has moments where it's kind of like, yeah, nope, that's still fourth line territory. He maybe makes a poor read, has a bit of a loose pass that just doesn't make sense. But then you also realize that he's had 10 plus goals in 10 minutes of ice time a night. So there's definitely an interesting player there with some considerable skill and upside. And I think if he gets a bigger role this year, maybe he even takes a bit of an offensive step forward. I don't know that he's really going to find it with this squad, but in terms of guys that I think continually intrigue me as players with some untapped potential, Barron continues to be a name that I still have an interest in. I don't know what he would be like with more skill to work with. Maybe he's just better off facing off against weaker opponents, but I mean, I wouldn't hate seeing him get some kind of a promotion this year in an experiment to see what he's got in the tank. Another guy that probably should get some attention, not necessarily because he's, again, fallen under the radar, but it's still in Sandberg, right? I think Sandberg's next step for his game is going to be increasing his offensive output. In terms of defensive impact, he's very clearly one of Winnipeg's best overall blue liners. But offensively, that's where his game hasn't really translated into a lot of high-end scoring. It's why I think he's still viewed as like a second pairing defender, but I think he's got some upside to his game. I think his skating and decision making are both generally pretty strong. I think it's just a question of, will he be a little bit more offensively aggressive and benefit from it this upcoming season? But I expect him to be among this team's best overall blue liners. I think he'll have a very strong D impact this year. Whether he starts to get some more shots on goal and maybe a few extra points remains to be seen. Now, you're probably going to ask me if I'm going to talk about the prospects. I mean, I guess I'm keeping my expectations modest. If there's a prospect that I think has the potential to really have a breakout year, it's not Lambert or Chibrikov or, guys like that. In part because I think that they definitely do have that potential and it wouldn't shock me. But the player that I think I'm actually considering and interested in is Chaz Lucius. I talked about him on the past couple of episodes. Lucius, like I've mentioned previously, has had a heck of a run to the NHL. It's basically been waylaid multiple times. And, he's getting to the age where you kind of hope that he's ready to make the pro jump. And unfortunately for him, he just hasn't been, healthy enough to actually stick around with a Moose for more than a handful of games at a time. So this coming year is kind of, for me, like the make or break season for him. But I really do feel like he's going to come out of camp and preseason really motivated. I continue to see flashes of that high-end Kyle Connor-esque scoring skill and playmaking that really Winnipeg just needs more of. His tool set is at times elite. Obviously, there are some parts of his game that are a little less elite, and let's be real, right? He's spent the last 2 or 3 years missing most of these last few seasons. So what his game now is kind of hard to say. I'd love to see him come into preseason and camp with renewed energy and focus. It's not really fair to expect him to come out swinging and really hit the ground running. But if there's a player who I feel like, frankly, deserves a breakout season and something good to go his way, just for once at least, it's got to be Chaz, man. The kid, seems really nice. It's really a shame that his career has taken such a sharp left turn to what it could have been. He should have honestly been in the NHL by now, perhaps anchoring Winnipeg's middle six. He would have been a great internal upgrade in the playoff run. I think his skating would have been a major improvement over some of the players the Jets brought in, and he has the finishing touch to be an elite finisher, but it's just he's never really gotten the chance. Kind of like Heinola breaking his ankle at the start of last season. Well, Lucius has broken many other things over the last few years, and it's really kept him from developing on a normal NHL pathway. But I still have some belief for him. I'm hoping that this is his year. I think a lot of people looked at, Velarde. I always say his career looked like it was over before it began. He had some really, really bad injuries, but here he is playing confidently, playing at a top level with the Jets. He's another technical breakout candidate, but I think he's so high profile that I feel like it's not really worth talking about that much. Just know that Velarde kicks a lot of butt. And if, Lucius is able to follow a similar pathway, get up to full strength and start to really adapt to the pro level, maybe he kills it with the Moose for a bit and then gets a call up and just never looks back. I think I'm dreaming of having him, join the Jets and become like a really amazing internal rental, another player that you don't give up on, that you still kind of keep around to see if he's just got a little bit more in the tank left to offer Winnipeg. But it's a two-way street, right? The Jets need to give him the right tools to succeed, and I hope that they are willing to give him a shot and see what he can do. But let me know what breakout candidates you're hoping for. Are there some players that you are really expecting to have big years that are perhaps not currently on the radar? Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. So as always, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. Have a great night and go Jets go.